Good morning, Christites. Today we have the discussion on GST. What's the big discussion about GST? Goods and service tax. It's been around 2 years since we're having the discussion on the GST. Every day it's been in the news. What's the big deal about GST? Why is the government taking such a long time to implement GST? So today's discussion, I hope, would be fruitful to know much more about GST and its implication on the state and the central revenue. Today we have with us Mr. Kanishk, Ms. Charu, and Mr. Pradyut from 6 Honors B. We would be deliberating on the goods and service tax and its implications. I would be giving an introduction about the GST in a short while so that you get a complete idea. So goods and service tax is basically it's going to subsume the various taxes that are levied at the central level. Could be central excise, could be service tax, and could be additional duty of customs. Okay, it's going to subsume most of the indirect taxes that are levied at the central level. GST probably would, the intention with which the GST has come into picture is to probably simplify the tax legislations and and maintain the uniformity in the taxes that are levied at the central level. So at present, it has not been passed even in the last budget because it's getting blocked in the Rajya Sabha. So we will look at the various aspects of the GST in the present discussion. So my first question to the panel members here is can you just simplify GST and tell us how would it have an implication on the common man?
So GST as such is the initiative of the government to basically imply one tax in one country. That's one India, one tax. So what they basically want to do is remove all the different taxes that are levied, as you said earlier, at a state level as well as a central level. So when a good is manufactured and it's sold, it is subject to many taxes. Let's say sales tax, a central excise, an octroi when goes from state to state. So what the GST aims to do is simplify this whole complicated tax regime, make the business be done easier in our country with one tax which would be common to the whole of the country, be it a good, be it a service, be it anything.
Just one clarification. When we talk about taxes here, it's largely to do with indirect taxes. So it's going to be the simplification of indirect taxes.
Now, my question is, how is it different from the present tax legislations? We already have Central Excise Act. We already have a Finance Act, which is implementing which is actually having the service tax. How is it different from the current tax regime?
Okay, to answer that question, one very big difference is that as of now, we have, for example, 3 different rates. There is a separate rate for central excise duty, a separate rate for VAT, a separate rate for sales tax. And anyone who manufactures any good, say this bottle, has to pay all these 3 taxes at different rates, at different levels. When GST is implemented, that manufacturer of this Bisleri bottle would have to pay only one tax, which would subsume all these 3 taxes under its head. Another difference is, as of now, when you pay sales tax to the state government, you cannot take a credit on that tax from the central government. So central excise duty is levied by the central government, and when you pay sales tax to the state government, you cannot take tax credit from the central government. When GST is implemented, you will be able to take credit for any tax that you have paid in the past, for any tax that you would pay in the future. That is how it would simplify the credit system and the tax system.
Also adding on to that, the current constitution which says regarding tax regime says that all states can levy their own indirect taxes. With the introduction of GST, that will get abolished, as there will be one central rate which will be followed across the country. Now, to expand on that, let's say Karnataka might have a higher sales tax than Maharashtra, and that's why Karnataka might have there'll be more incentive for businesses to operate in Maharashtra instead of Karnataka. But with the introduction of GST, there'll be one tax rate across the country, so it'll be equal opportunities in each state for every business to operate.
Now, what I understand from the GST is it is one tax. From what you guys say, there is slightly a difference in the way we claim credit for the taxes that we have paid at the inputs. So GST would probably simplify in understanding the tax credit system which is also at present, as Charu was pointing out, that you cannot claim credit for the taxes that you have paid on the inputs if it is a state VAT from the central excise or from the central service tax that I've paid. So the GST would make things much more simpler. One unified tax rate or dual tax rate as is proposed in the Empowered Committee report. So I think this would make things much simpler. Okay, let's coming back to the discussion. Around already 160 countries have already implemented GST. Implementing in India is taking a long time. Why is it different compared to the other countries, and what way it is different compared to the other 160 countries?
Well, if you look at the other 160 countries, they have only one GST. In India, because there is a federal form of government, you have a central GST and a state GST. If you look at it from the justification given by the government, it's that because India has a federal structure, there exist two levels of almost all authorities, like the High Court, the Supreme Court, the central government, the state government. So the same gets translated into the GST as well. We have a central GST and a state GST. Now, I have one doubt from the panel here. So when you're saying one uniform rate, for state GST also, is there going to be one uniform rate, or is that only for central GST?
How it happens is that we'll talk about this in the coming minutes also, as to what the government plans to do is create one body, a council, which is known as the GST council, and that will have a 1/3 representation from the state.
I think it's a two-third representation
two-third
from the state
states
governments,
from-
1/3 from the central. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is the proposed voting power in that. So this committee decides as to what the tax rate would be. So if the GST tax rate is, let's say, 16%, then it would probably be that 8% goes to the state goods and service tax, the SGST, and another 8% goes to the central government, that's the CGST. So that's how it's divided. There'll be one tax rate which will be divided, a portion between the state and the center.
Also, coming back to the question of how other countries have implemented GST and how it's different in our country, one is other countries have a uniform rate, unlike India, where we've proposed a dual rate system, which would not give consumers or the users of GST the exact benefit that GST is supposed to give to the consumers. Secondly, the infrastructure of India is not so strong to subsume GST and implement GST in its true sense. All the other countries, I would give example of Australia. Australia took around 4 years to implement GST in its true sense, and at that point of time, Australia's infrastructure level was much better than what we have in India as of now. So it would take India a lot on the infrastructure and administration side to implement GST and give the customers the required benefit from GST.
Another point as to why it is a challenge to implement something like GST in a country like India is because of the sheer size of the country. You have 29 different states, each having a different motive, each having its different strength contributing towards the nation's growth. But what GST does is unifies all that. So the reason as to why it's not getting passed so soon is because there are some states who will face a huge loss. Like states like Gujarat will tend to lose, it's estimated to be around 10,500 crore per annum just by the introduction of GST. So then there are some states who will gain from GST. So due to this conflict, it's another challenge as to why it's not being passed yet in the houses.
So what I can make out from the discussion is that there are some states who are likely to lose the revenue, and there are some states who are likely to gain and that's the reason I think, if I'm not wrong, there must be many sittings of state finance ministers which would have already happened, and still we are not able to do anything concrete on GST. It's because there are 29 states, federal structure. It's quite difficult to convince each state finance minister to come to a consensus on GST. At one point or the other, we will have to come to a consensus, do a bit of compromise on each state, so because it's all about India. So at this present juncture, what we need to know is that how GST, you think, would benefit the exporters?
It has been researched by National Council of Applied Research in India that if GST is implemented, the prices would go down by 0.2%. Now, this 0.2% would be a very big benefit to all manufacturers, especially exporters, because they would become more competitive in the global economy. GST also gives a lot of exemptions to exporters, as if you're a 100% export oriented unit, you are exempted from taxes. So these exemptions would continue, and the reduction in prices due to less number of taxes would also reduce the price of a particular good which is exported, hence making exporters competitive in the market.
Okay, so the prices are likely to decrease in the export markets. Okay. Kanishka, I have a question. We are talking about the constitutional amendment. I think it's still blocked in the Rajya Sabha because it is not getting the majority in the Rajya Sabha, and that's the reason we could not implement the GST in this in the last budget. And why does the GST you think require a constitutional amendment? I think there was an amendment to 246A, Article 246A. Why do you think it requires a constitutional amendment?
Well, before I get into the details of why it requires a constitutional amendment, we need to understand what is the procedure for a constitutional amendment. So, when you're going for a constitutional amendment, according to the constitution, you need a two-third majority in both the houses. So, you need two-third members in the Lok Sabha and two-third members in the Raj Sabha for that amendment. Along with that, you also need the ratification of half of the states. So that means if there are 29 states in India, you need the ratification of 50% plus one, that is 15 states. So 15 state assemblies at the majority level plus the two assemblies at the center at the two-third majority need to make the amendment. So we require a lot of consensus. Now, why is that amendment required in the first place? That's because as of now, duty on services is charged, if I'm not wrong, by the central government, and on sales it's done by the state government. So to bring about that consensus, that middle point, you need the constitutional amendment.
Okay. And I was just going through the report of the Empowered Committee, which has been submitted to the Government of India. And it has been proposed under the GST that a PAN-based registration is allotted under the GST. How a PAN-based registration allotted under the GST would be different from the existing registrations which are happening either at the VAT level or the central level registrations?
So, the current situation in the economy is that for income taxes, you have a PAN linked system wherein your PAN card number is the way to track any income tax pay. But when it comes to indirect taxes, there is no such PAN linked system. However, if GST is implemented, we would have a PAN linked system similar to the income tax department, wherein the company's or an individual's PAN card number would be linked to the GST code of that particular company, and that would help in better administration, I would say, because you can measure, or I would say recheck the amount of sales or revenue that a company is portraying to the income tax department and to the indirect taxes department. So first of all, it would increase self compliance, because then consumers or manufacturers would know that I have to portray the same numbers to both the departments since they are linked to the same account. Secondly, it would reduce tax evasion by manufacturers who are portraying different revenues to different departments, taking advantage of the loopholes in the system. So a very big loophole would be conquered, and I think that should end corruption when it comes to, or evasion when it comes to, the consumer's point of view.
Also, to add to that, is how the central government proposes to implement GST all around the country is by the GST Council itself sharing the technology for taxes. Now, the indirect taxes which are collected by the states, each state might have a different way of collecting these taxes, but through GST, what the central government aims to do is they itself provide the technology and the human resource to collect these taxes. So it will be collected by the GST Council itself. So that way, there's only one single body who's in charge of collecting the tax and not the states independently. So that also increases the transparency as to who's collecting the money, because there's only one person.
Okay, as I think the Kanishka was pointing out, that there are some powers of the state governments which are taken away by the central government, and there are some powers of the central governments which are now being given to the state governments. That's the reason why the constitutional amendment was required. Now, this GST probably would shuffle the powers between the states and the central governments. And as Pradyut was pointing out, the GST Council and your PAN-based registration numbers, all this probably would increase or would improve the tax administration and its compliance. Okay, well, coming to the next question, and what are the taxes that are proposed to be subsumed under the existing GST proposal?
GST would subsume all indirect taxes apart from customs duty. So if you're an importer or exporter, you would still pay customs duty and GST, but you would say not pay sales tax, VAT, or central excise duty. So every other indirect tax apart from customs duty would be subsumed under GST to simplify the tax system. the one reason why customs duty is not subsumed is because when you're an exporter and importer, you are dealing with two different countries, and to comply with the regulations of the United Nations, we need to have customs duty in every country.
So otherwise, I think at present there are 8 state central taxes that are being levied by the central government. So most of the taxes would be subsumed under GST to simplify. Okay, and looking at, see, there are some products, some taxes which are kept outside the purview of GST. The first being petroleum products, and second being the alcohol under the state excise. Why do you think is the reason to keep these products away from the the GST proposal?
One point I would say for the alcoholic beverages, wherein it's still being purviewed under the state level VAT and all those indirect taxes, because alcohol as a product, it generates more revenue for a state, and in the short run it is estimated that some states will lose a lot of revenue. So leaving at least a few of these products like alcohol and petroleum under the purview of the state for a while, and then probably it is proposed that they will soon get into the under the purview of the GST. So it's more like a temporary thing, temporary thing which is not kept under the purview of GST, but in the future it is proposed to come under. So for
In the
short,
future, it is proposed to come under GST. Okay.
yes. So until the state, so at least state governments still have some portion of revenue they can control among them in their hands. So even they have some control over amount of money they're getting, and they're not disturbed. Their revenue stream is not disturbed by the introduction of GST.
Okay. Pradit, how the state governments are planning to finance their events, are planning to finance their activities during the first few years of the loss of revenue?
So this is mainly with concern to the manufacturing heavy states whose economy is dependent on manufacturing, like Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. So what the central what this that's the reason as I said earlier, as to why GST is not being passed. So what the central government has done is that the GST Council says that for a period of 5 years they will reimburse each state who will tend to lose money because of the introduction of GST. Now, let's say they don't say 100%, but at least to some point. Let's say now Gujarat, who loses 10,500 crore because the GST is introduced. What the GST Council will do is it'll reimburse at least some part of that loss to Gujarat for a period.
Okay, I think that is the reason under the proposed GST. I think 5 years they're going to compensate for the loss of the revenue to the state governments. Okay, and that's how they are bringing them to a consensus to implement the GST. Okay, so then much more on GST. There are few things that I understand that by implementing GST it would contribute to few things. Something like it would result in the less corruption, good administration, and it would boost the growth of the Indian economy, and also it's likely to work on a concept of revenue neutrality. Can you please throw light on what is that?
I had a question if the panel would want to take, including the moderator. The GST Council that we have, or it's proposed to be have, who exactly appoints the GST Council and who are the members of the GST Council?
GST Council would have the representations both from the central government and the state government, as he was trying to point out, that even the state finance ministers would also be members of the GST. And it would have majority of the representation would be from the state government. So if you want to make any changes in the proposed any sort of GST rates, anything of that sort, you need to get a consent of the state representatives. Only then it gets passed in the GST. It would, what I mean to say is, it would have a equal representation even from the state government. So it is not that just because the central government want to levy taxes or want to increase the state taxes, it cannot do that because there is a representation from the state councils.
Another point to add to the GST Council is, as I said earlier, 2/3 is represented by the different states and 1/3 by the central government. And for anything to get passed from the GST Council, you require 2/3 majority before anything passes. So you will gain a balance between what the state wants and the center wants for a 2/3 majority to pass.
Coming back to the question that Sir was pointing out, yes, it would lead to development of the economy, as has been predicted that if GST is implemented, it would lead to a 2% growth of the current GDP of our country. That is mainly because more self-compliance by people, since only one tax to be paid and no more running around in different offices. And it would also lead to less corruption, less red tapeism, and this would make, as pointed out before.
Yeah, I think I was also reading a report on the GST, wherein it talks about 2% increase in the GDP, expected increase. if let's not keep it realistic, even if it is unrealistic, even 1% increase in the GDP would definitely at this juncture add on to our growth of the economy. Looking at the way the indicators not doing pretty well in the economy, I think that 1% increase in the GDP would add on a lot to our GDP. So I
And
think
just
yeah,
revenue
yeah,
neutrality.
revenue neutrality.
Neutrality
Okay.
was the question. So the concept of revenue neutrality in GST means that no one with the implementation of GST would lose any revenue, neither the states nor the center. When it comes to the state, as mentioned, the states would be compensated for any revenue loss because of implementation of GST, and the center would earn the same amount of revenue by levying different tax rates. So as of now, services are charged at 10% tax rate, and the proposed rate of GST is between 15 to 20%, wherein goods or manufactured goods are charged at around 25%, and they would be brought down to around 15 to 20%. So there is a balance as to some goods would be more expensive while some would become cheaper because of the implementation of GST, which would enhance revenue neutrality amongst the system.
Well, I think one very important point that she highlighted was that when GST comes, it reduces the bureaucratic procedures of people to pay taxes. And I think both of my friends attended the startup summit that was organized by Z Business in our Block 4 auditorium, and almost every startup CEO who had come there had said that we don't want any financial help from the government, we don't want any funds from the government. If only the compliance procedures and the bureaucratic procedures can be reduced, it would help us a lot. So I think that really is a boost for the business if GST comes into power.
One thing I would like to move back into the discussion a bit. We've kept saying that some states will tend to lose money, but we haven't discussed as to why they will lose money, which is, I think, so one point which we need to discuss.
Yes.
So, what in the current tax structure is that now, when let's say a factory in Maharashtra manufactures goods and it is selling it to someone, let's say either in Maharashtra or somewhere else, the point at which it's taxed is it's the minute it leaves the factory, it is taxed. But now, what GST aims to do it is that once it's sold and once it comes into the hands of the buyer, that is at the point of consumption, it is taxed. Now, if it's a sale from Maharashtra to Maharashtra, let's say someone manufacturing Mumbai and selling to someone in Pune, it's not a problem because the same state gets it. But let's say I manufacture a good in Mumbai and I sell it to someone in Bangalore, Karnataka will be getting that state level tax, and that is why these manufacturing heavy states are against it, because the whole point of taxation changes from point of
Yeah, to
removal
add
of
on to what
factory.
you say, I think the GST is now becoming a destination-based tax from a origin-based tax, and that's why many of the states are opposing, especially the consuming states are now likely to gain revenue rather than the producing states. So, yeah.
Adding on to that, there is one amendment in the GST bill which is an interstate 1% tax, which says that if you are manufacturing a good in Maharashtra and say selling it in Karnataka, the central government would charge 1% tax from Karnataka and pay that 1% tax to Maharashtra. So Maharashtra would not lose. I mean, it's not a very heavy compensation, but a compensation nonetheless to the producing state for taking up
I think there is
the
something called
responsibility.
inter-goods and service tax, wherein you can
Interstate
levy
Interstate
1%
tax.
extra to the
Consuming
to
state
the
to compensate
for
the producing
okay,
state.
okay, okay. Okay, and have the last question here. We will wind up the session now soon after the question. Uh, the why do you think the few state governments, as I said, okay, that's a question covered. What are the tax rates? Can we just simplify the tax rates under the proposed existing system? What are the tax rates? You were talking about 15 to 20%. Are there some goods which are taxed at the higher rate? Some goods which what about the exemptions? Would they continue under the GST? Okay, so
So, as I mentioned earlier, the proposed rate is somewhere between 15 to 20%. It would become more apparent as and when the bill passes the Rajya Sabha and they have more discussion over it. And also, as I mentioned before, with the implementation of GST, services will become little more expensive since the current tax rate on services is only 10%, and manufactured goods would become a little cheaper since their current tax rate is above 25%. And also to mention about exemptions, the current exemptions for small scale industries would continue under the GST purview. So there is something called as a consuming there's an amendment in the bill which says that there'll be a certain threshold which would be uniform for all states. So the
Okay,
difference
what are
is
the present thresholds under the state VAT
state
legislations would continue even
continue
under the
under
GST.
the GST.
So that's how it's going to benefit the small entrepreneurs and the small scale industries. So I think it's time that the government realizes that their political motives should be kept, should not be given more importance to rather than the country's perspective. So it's important. It's important that the countries realize that implementation of GST is important. I mean, it's beneficial for the country. It's been around 4 successive government, 14 years from now. I think the GST, nothing much has been done to implement the GST. I hope that uh, at least in the coming year, the government realizes the importance of it, and even the opposition should make something to implement the GST. Even a 1% GDP increase would definitely add up at this juncture when other economies are not doing well. It would definitely add up to our, the GDP. Thanks for all the panel members here. Thanks for joining us. I remain. Thank you.